I never imagined that, at nearly 60 years old, I would stand in the middle of a glittering ballroom in Dallas, Texas, with blood trickling down my lip. The chandeliers sparkled above me. The string quartet was still playing faintly, but the only sound echoing in my ears was the gasp of hundreds of guests as a young woman's fist landed across my face. Her name was Tiffany. She was not my friend. She was not even just a colleague. She was my husband's mistress, his open secret, the woman he paraded around our social circle as if she was a trophy he had earned. And that night, in front of city leaders, investors, and society's elite, she decided to humiliate me the way she thought I deserved. The sting on my cheek was sharp, but the deeper pain came from what I saw next. My husband Richard rushed forward, not to hold me, not to protect me, but to wrap his arms around Tiffany, as if she were the victim. I saw his lips whisper, "Calm down, baby," while I stood alone, bleeding, in front of strangers who didn't know whether to look away or keep staring. For a moment, the world slowed. My chest tightened. 35 years of marriage, 3 grown sons, a lifetime of sacrifice, all of it flickered in my memory in that single second. I had devoted my life to building his empire, to raising our children, to being his partner through storms. And now, in return, I was the woman being struck and discarded like a prop, no longer useful. But then, something happened that neither Richard nor Tiffany expected. From the far side of the ballroom, 3 familiar figures emerged. 3 men in dark suits, with eyes blazing, not just with anger, but with justice. Before the chaos of that night, before the slap that echoed through the ballroom, my life once looked like the picture of an American dream. When I first met Richard, I was only 22, freshly graduated from college, working as a teacher in Dallas. He was ambitious, charming, and full of ideas about real estate. We fell in love quickly, the kind of whirlwind romance you only see in movies. By 23, I was his wife. We didn't have much back then, just a tiny rented apartment with peeling wallpaper and 1 second-hand sofa. But we had each other. I cooked casseroles in a chipped baking dish, and he would come home with big plans scribbled on napkins. We laughed at our own struggles, promising one day we'd look back and see how far we had come. And we did. Over the next 35 years, Richard built his company from the ground up. I stood beside him at every step, raising our 3 sons while also helping him entertain clients, host dinners, and keep our home warm and inviting. People admired us. At church on Sundays, older couples would smile and say, "That's a marriage made to last." I believed it too. Every Christmas morning when the boys tore through wrapping paper in their pajamas, Richard would kiss my forehead and whisper, "We're building something beautiful, Maggie." And I believed him with my whole heart. Those were golden years. We had barbecues in the backyard, 4th of July fireworks with neighbors, and long drives through Texas countryside. My boys grew into kind, disciplined young men. David, Michael, and James. They were my pride, my reason for everything. I truly thought our family was unbreakable. I thought Richard was my partner forever. But promises age. Love, when not nurtured, corrodes. And as I stood in that ballroom decades later, blood on my lip, I realized those golden years were only memories. Memories that would soon clash with betrayal too loud to ignore. If there is one thing in my life that has never betrayed me, it is the love I poured into my 3 sons and the love they gave back to me tenfold. From the day each of them was born, I felt my purpose deepen. They were not just children, they were my anchors, the proof that my sacrifices mattered. David, my eldest, came first. From the time he was a boy, he had a sharp sense of justice. He would argue his way out of bedtime with logic that made even me laugh. I wasn't surprised when he grew up to become a lawyer in Dallas. Today, his presence in any room carries authority. He doesn't just know the law, he knows how to wield it to defend those he loves. Michael, my middle child, has always been the gentle one. When he was a teenager, he volunteered at hospitals, holding the hands of patients who had no family by their side. That compassion never left him. He became a physician, saving lives not with arrogance, but with kindness. People trust him because his heart is pure. And then there's James, my youngest. He was restless as a boy, always running toward danger instead of away from it. That energy turned into bravery and eventually into a career in law enforcement. He wears his badge not for power, but because he believes protecting people is the noblest job a man can have. The three of them are different in nature, but together they are a force. My sons are my shield, even when they don't speak it out loud. I didn't realize how closely they were watching me during those difficult months with Richard. I thought I was carrying the weight alone. But mothers forget. Children grow up studying us more than we ever know. And on that night in the ballroom, when I was struck and humiliated, I learned just how deeply my sons had absorbed the lessons I once whispered to them. Lessons about courage, about justice, about standing tall when someone tries to break you. The first cracks in my marriage didn't appear with shouting or slammed doors. They came quietly, like whispers in the dark, so subtle that at first I convinced myself I was only imagining things. Richard, once a man who never missed family dinners, began working late more often. He claimed business demanded more of him now, and I wanted to believe that. After all, I had watched him build his company from the ground up. But small habits changed. He no longer kissed me goodbye in the mornings. When he came home, his suit smelled faintly of perfume that was not mine. He carried his phone everywhere, guarding it like it contained state secrets. At dinner, while I tried to share stories about the boys or church activities, his eyes drifted to the glow of his screen instead of looking at me. I told myself it was just stress. Men at 60 face pressure, health, work, money. I had been his partner for decades. Surely I owed him patience. Yet, patience became loneliness. Nights once filled with laughter or debates about politics turned into long silences. He sat in his leather chair with a drink, scrolling, while I folded laundry in another room, wondering how the house could feel so full yet so empty. One evening, I noticed something chilling. On his shirt collar lingered a fragrance, floral, expensive, far too youthful to belong to me. It wasn't from a client, I knew that in my bones. My heart thudded, but I said nothing. Silence was my shield. Not because I was weak, but because I understood storms reveal themselves without needing to be forced. And deep down I felt it. Our marriage was shifting. Something precious was slipping through my fingers, and the man who once held my hand like a lifeline now seemed like a stranger, living under the same roof. There are moments in life when time itself seems to split in half, before and after. For me, that moment came one late autumn evening, years before the slap in the ballroom. Richard and I were sitting in our small living room, the boys already asleep upstairs. The fire crackled softly, and he took my hand with unusual tenderness. "I'll never hurt you, Maggie," he whispered, his eyes locked on mine. "You're my only one. No matter how hard things get, I'll always protect us." Those words sank deep into me like a sacred vow. I believed him. I wanted to. After all, hadn't we built everything together? Our house, our family, our dreams. They were ours, stitched with the fabric of sacrifice and trust. But years later, as I stared at a picture glowing on my phone screen, a picture of Richard in Las Vegas, laughing with Tiffany in a low-cut dress, I felt that promise shatter. My friend had sent it to me quietly, not wanting me to be blindsided. In the photo, Richard looked 20 years younger, his hand resting on Tiffany's waist like it belonged there. My chest tightened. I remembered his vow, that warm night by the fire, and the cruel irony made me dizzy. It wasn't just the betrayal of his body, it was the betrayal of every word he had once spoken to keep me safe. I didn't scream. I didn't call him out. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and sat in silence. My silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. Still, inside, I broke. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly love had turned into performance, when devotion had soured into lies. That photograph was the first cut. It wouldn't be the last. And as I looked at Richard across the dinner table in the days that followed, I saw not a partner, but a stranger rehearsing excuses I was no longer willing to hear. The first time I saw Tiffany up close, it wasn't at a family dinner or even by accident in a grocery store aisle. It was at Richard's company headquarters, a glass building I had helped him dream into reality decades earlier. I walked in with homemade cookies for the staff, something I used to do often when we were younger. But this time something felt different. She was already there, perched behind the reception desk, her red lipstick bright as a stop sign, her heels clicking across the marble floor like she owned it. She greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mrs. Collins," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. What a surprise. The way she emphasized Mrs. made my skin prickle. Employees passing by exchanged awkward glances, as if they knew more than I did. One whispered something to another, and they both avoided my eyes. Later, at a staff gathering, I caught Tiffany laughing too loudly at Richard's jokes, touching his arm like she had every right. And worse, he didn't pull away. It wasn't hidden anymore. She was stepping into the light, daring me to notice. People began treating her like a permanent fixture. She offered opinions on company strategy, corrected younger employees, and even sat beside Richard at meetings I used to attend. Once I overheard her say, "Some traditions are outdated. The company needs fresh energy." Her eyes flicked toward me as she said it. It was more than an affair now. It was a takeover. She wasn't satisfied with his affection. She wanted my seat at the table, my role as his partner, even the respect I had earned over decades. I smiled politely that day, thanked the staff, and left the building with my head held high. But inside, a storm brewed. She thought I was invisible. She thought my silence meant surrender. What she didn't understand was that silence can be the sharpest blade. And one day, it would cut deeper than she ever imagined. After Tiffany's bold display at the company, I realized something with painful clarity. I could no longer dismiss her as just a passing distraction. She had embedded herself into Richard's world, and he allowed it. But instead of exploding with rage or confronting them in public, I chose a weapon far sharper: silence paired with patience. Every morning while Richard rushed out the door with barely a goodbye, I watched. When he claimed late-night meetings, I took note of the exact times he left and returned. I didn't accuse, I didn't cry, I documented. Soon I began collecting small pieces of evidence, fragments of truth that, alone, seemed harmless, but together, told a damning story. A hotel receipt from Las Vegas tucked into his jacket pocket. Credit card charges for designer dresses in sizes I hadn't worn in decades. Restaurant bills for two when he had told me he was traveling alone. I saved screenshots of social media posts Tiffany couldn't resist sharing, boasting about champagne in private lounges, her nails brushing against the rim of Richard's glass. Each image was a brick in the case I was quietly building. I reached out to a discreet lawyer friend of David's, asking simple questions about marital assets and Texas law. I wasn't ready to act, but I needed to know my rights. Knowledge became my armor. All the while, at home, I played the role of the dutiful wife. I cooked dinners, attended church, hosted neighbors with a warm smile. Richard believed my silence was ignorance. Tiffany believed my quiet meant weakness. Neither saw the strength in restraint. What they didn't know was that silence can roar louder than screams when the moment is right. And though I had not chosen the battlefield, I was preparing myself for the war they had brought to my doorstep. The time for truth was approaching, and I intended to meet it not with chaos, but with dignity sharp enough to slice through every lie. The invitation arrived in a thick white envelope embossed with gold lettering. Richard handed it to me casually one evening, as if it were no different than a utility bill. "It's the annual business gala," he said, pouring himself a drink. "You should come this year. It looks better if my wife is there." The word stung. My wife. Not my partner, not my Maggie. Just a title, like a prop to complete an image. For weeks he had been distant, and now suddenly my presence mattered. Not for love, but for appearances. Still, I agreed. Part of me wanted to see with my own eyes what had been whispered in corners and captured in photos. Part of me wanted to hold my head high in front of Dallas society, no matter how much my heart ached. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully. I chose a navy blue gown I had worn years ago, simple but elegant. As I looked in the mirror, I whispered to myself, "You are not invisible. You are not small." When we arrived at the hotel, the air was thick with perfume and power. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors. Men in tuxedos shook Richard's hand. Women in sequined gowns leaned close to whisper. And then, across the room, I saw her, Tiffany. Dressed in scarlet silk, her hair cascading in waves, her lips painted like fire. She looked directly at me, not with shame, but with triumph. She didn't hide in shadows anymore. She thrived in the spotlight, standing close enough to Richard that whispers turned into certainty. I forced myself to smile politely at acquaintances, to sip my champagne slowly. But inside, my stomach churned. This was no longer just business. This was theater, and I was cast in a role I hadn't auditioned for. The aging wife paraded beside the radiant mistress. What none of them knew, what even Tiffany didn't know, was that this stage would soon turn into a battlefield. And before the night was over, every mask would fall. It began with words. They always do. I was standing near the buffet table, politely chatting with a board member's wife, when Tiffany's laughter pierced the room like broken glass. She strutted toward me, her red dress shimmering under the chandeliers. People turned their heads, sensing the storm about to hit. Well, well, she sneered loudly enough for the crowd to hear. So this is the wife? Forgive me, I thought you were the nanny. Or maybe the housekeeper. Laughter rippled uncomfortably through the circle around us. Eyes darted between Richard, who sipped his drink without protest, and me, standing frozen with a glass of champagne in hand. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, she stepped closer, her perfume suffocating. Tell me, Mrs. Collins, she said mockingly, do you enjoy living off a man's success while the rest of us actually work for it? Gasps fluttered through the room. My cheeks burned, not from shame but from rage boiling beneath my skin. I wanted to respond, to remind her of the years I had spent raising children while supporting Richard's empire, but my voice caught in my throat. And then, without warning, her hand shot out. The crack of her palm against my face echoed louder than the music. My glass shattered on the marble floor, champagne spilling across my gown. The sting burned, but the silence afterward cut deeper. I looked toward Richard. For one desperate moment, I thought he would defend me. Instead, he rushed to Tiffany's side, wrapping his arms around her trembling act. Calm down, baby, he whispered, shielding her from the consequences of what she had just done. The crowd stood in stunned disbelief. My dignity lay in shards at my feet, alongside broken glass. But what Tiffany didn't know, what Richard refused to see, was that I was not alone that night. 3 pairs of eyes had witnessed everything, and they were about to change the game. The ballroom froze. For a few long seconds, the only sound was the faint dripping of champagne from my broken glass onto the marble floor. Tiffany clung to Richard's arm, pretending to tremble, while he shielded her with his body like she was the injured one. Not a word of defense for me, his wife of 35 years. Not a glance of concern for the blood forming at the corner of my lip. The crowd didn't know where to look. Some stared at the ground, embarrassed by the scene. Others whispered, their eyes darting between Richard and me, waiting for someone, anyone to step in. But no one moved. I stood there, my cheek throbbing, my dignity hanging by a thread. Inside, I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence with the truth of decades of sacrifice. But something inside me chose differently. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and let the silence speak for me. And that silence was deafening. It unsettled people more than any shouting could have. Guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing the weight of what had just happened. The humiliation wasn't just mine. It belonged to Richard, too, though he didn't see it yet. I caught sight of my reflection in the mirrored wall across the ballroom. A woman with a swollen cheek, but eyes that refused to dim. For the first time that night, I felt something powerful, strength in restraint. Then, from the far corner of the room, movement stirred. 3 familiar figures had witnessed everything. My sons, David, Michael, and James, stood at the edge of the crowd, their jaws tight, their eyes locked on me. They had seen their mother struck. They had seen their father's betrayal, and they were no longer going to stay silent. The room held its breath, unaware that justice was already walking toward the center of the floor. And Tiffany was about to learn what happens when a mother's dignity awakens her son's fury. The crowd parted without a word, as if some unspoken force demanded it. From the far end of the ballroom, my 3 sons stepped forward, each one radiating a different kind of power. David, the eldest, in his tailored navy suit, walked with the steady confidence of a man who had argued in front of judges and juries. His sharp eyes scanned the room, locking onto Richard, and I could see the disappointment written all over his face. Michael, the middle child, moved beside him. His physician's calm was gone, replaced by a protective fury I had only seen once before, when a patient had been mistreated. His hands clenched, not to strike, but to hold back the rage boiling in his chest. And then there was James, my youngest, his posture unmistakable. The badge may not have been pinned to his chest tonight, but his presence carried the authority of law itself. His steps were measured, deliberate, his eyes dark with a promise that wrongs would not go unanswered. The guests turned, whispering, "Those are her sons." Their voices carried admiration, even awe, as the three men closed in around me. No longer was I standing alone, humiliated in front of strangers. I was surrounded by the very men I had raised to value justice, dignity, and loyalty. Richard's face paled. Tiffany's smirk faltered, though she tried to hide it behind her painted lips. They had expected me to remain silent, powerless. They hadn't counted on my sons. David spoke first, his voice like thunder in the silence. "Enough." His single word cut sharper than Tiffany's slap. The entire ballroom seemed to shift. What had been a scene of mockery was now charged with anticipation. My sons weren't just stepping into the spotlight, they were taking control of it. And the reckoning that Richard and Tiffany thought would never come had finally arrived. David stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority honed in countless courtrooms. The chatter in the ballroom hushed instantly, as though everyone sensed they were about to witness more than family drama. This was a trial unfolding in real time. He pulled a slim folder from inside his suit jacket. "Richard Collins," he began, his tone steady, "my father. Tonight, in front of Dallas's finest, your mistress struck my mother. That is assault. But her hand is not the only crime in this room." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's face flushed red. Tiffany gripped his arm tighter, but David pressed on. "For months, I've watched you funnel marital assets into accounts Tiffany controls. Lavish trips, jewelry, designer clothes, and hotel suites, all paid for with funds that legally belong to both my parents. Under Texas law, that is marital fraud." He laid a stack of documents on a nearby table where board members and investors could see. "Here are the credit card statements. Here are the wire transfers. Here are photos from Las Vegas, New Orleans, and Miami. Each time, money left the family account. Each time, it landed in Tiffany's hands." The ballroom buzzed with shock. Executives leaned closer, whispering. One of Richard's partners muttered, "This could ruin him." David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I am not just speaking as a son tonight," he said firmly. "I am speaking as a lawyer licensed by the state of Texas. And I promise you this, my mother's dignity will not be trampled, not by Tiffany, and not by you, Father." He turned slightly, his gaze cutting through Tiffany like a blade. "The law is watching, the city is watching, and we will not stay silent." The ballroom erupted in murmurs, but one thing was certain. David had shifted the balance of power, and Richard knew it. Before the murmurs of the crowd could settle, Michael stepped forward. His presence was different from David's. Where David's words cut with the sharpness of law, Michael's carried the calm but undeniable weight of a man who had seen life and death in his hands. His voice was lower, steadier, but it silenced the room just the same. He looked directly at Tiffany, his gaze unflinching. "I'm a physician," he said, his tone precise. "Every day, I treat people who have been assaulted, people whose lives are changed forever by violence. Tonight, in front of hundreds of witnesses, you committed battery against my mother. Don't think the glitter of this ballroom hides that truth. It doesn't." Tiffany shifted uncomfortably, her painted smile trembling. She glanced at Richard as if waiting for him to intervene, but Michael continued, his voice steady as steel. "I see victims who come into my hospital, bruised, bleeding, broken. Some are strangers. But tonight, the victim is my own mother. A woman who gave her life to raise 3 sons. A woman who sacrificed so this family could thrive." His words sliced through the air, sharper than any scalpel. He stepped closer, lowering his tone but raising the intensity. "If this were my emergency room, I'd already have documented the assault, taken photos of the injuries, and called the police. I can still do that, right here, right now." The crowd gasped. Tiffany's face drained of color. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Michael didn't shout. He didn't need to. The quiet conviction in his voice carried more power than anger ever could. "You think this is a game, Tiffany? It's not. Actions have consequences, and you just crossed a line you can't uncross." For the first time that evening, Tiffany's bravado cracked, and the ballroom could feel it. The tide was turning. The room was still vibrating from Michael's words when James, my youngest, stepped forward. Unlike his brothers, he didn't carry documents or medical authority. He carried something heavier, the unmistakable weight of the law. James had always walked with a steady stride, the kind that let people know he didn't bluff. Even now, in a tailored black suit instead of his uniform, his posture gave him away. When he spoke, his voice cut through the noise like a siren at midnight. "My name is Officer James Collins," he announced, reaching into his jacket. From his pocket, he pulled his badge and held it high enough for the chandeliers to catch its shine. Gasps swept across the ballroom. "I may be off duty tonight, but assault is a crime every day of the week, and what we all just witnessed was assault." He turned his eyes directly to Tiffany, his jaw clenched. "You struck my mother in front of hundreds of witnesses. That's not drama, that's not gossip, it's battery under Texas law. I can place you under arrest right here, right now." The crowd erupted into whispers. Tiffany stiffened, her hand clutching Richard's sleeve as if he could shield her from the law itself. Richard stammered, "James, let's not exaggerate." But his voice faltered under the weight of his own son's authority. James didn't flinch. "You think because this is a ballroom filled with wealth and power that the law doesn't apply? Think again. Justice doesn't care about chandeliers and champagne." His voice grew colder. "If my mother wants to press charges, I'll have officers here in minutes." Silence fell. The kind of silence that comes when every mask has been stripped away. Guests exchanged looks, some shocked, others nodding in agreement. For the first time, Tiffany's arrogance cracked into fear. And in that moment, Richard realized what he was truly up against. Not just a betrayed wife, but 3 sons united, armed with truth, medicine, and law. For years, Richard had carried himself like a king, shoulders squared, chin high, convinced that his wealth and charm could shield him from consequence. But as my sons closed in, the illusion of power slipped from him like water through open hands. His face, once flushed with arrogance, turned pale beneath the ballroom lights. The sweat on his brow glistened, betraying the fear he tried to mask behind a forced smile. He looked around the room, searching for allies among his colleagues, his investors, his so-called friends. None stepped forward. Eyes that once admired him now watched with judgment, even disgust. Tiffany clung to his arm, her earlier bravado fading into nervous tremors. She whispered something in his ear, but the words were drowned by the murmurs of the crowd. For the first time, I saw panic flash in her eyes. She had thought she was untouchable, the starlet basking in stolen spotlight. Now, under the scrutiny of hundreds, she looked small. Richard raised his hand as if to calm the room. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. His voice cracked, lacking the commanding tone he once wielded so easily. "My sons are exaggerating. Tiffany, she didn't mean." But the words fell flat. No one believed him. His empire, built over decades, was unraveling not with lawsuits or bankruptcies, but with truth laid bare in front of society. I stood quietly, my cheek still burning from Tiffany's slap, and watched the man I once loved stumble under the weight of his own choices. This was not the Richard I married, the ambitious dreamer who once promised to protect me. This was a hollow man exposed, stripped of dignity by his own betrayal. The silence of the crowd was louder than boos. It was abandonment. And in that moment, Richard realized he was no longer the respected businessman of Dallas. He was simply a husband who betrayed his wife, a father who failed his sons, and a man on the verge of collapse. As Richard faltered and Tiffany clung to him like a drowning woman to driftwood, a new voice rose from the crowd. It was quiet at first, but it carried a weight that made the room turn. "I know her," a young woman said, stepping forward. She was one of the junior staffers at Richard's firm, someone Tiffany had likely dismissed as insignificant. Her voice trembled, but her courage held. "I know what Tiffany has done." The room fell silent again. Tiffany's eyes widened, and she shook her head furiously. "Don't you dare," she hissed, but it was too late. The staffer continued, louder now. "She's not loyal to Richard. She's used men in this company before, manipulated them, drained them, and discarded them. She bragged about it in the break room. I heard her myself." Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Another employee raised his hand. "It's true. Tiffany once cornered me after a meeting, trying to flirt her way into contracts. When I refused, she threatened to make my life miserable at work. One by one, others began to nod, whisper, and share. A pattern emerged, not of love, but of calculation. Tiffany wasn't just a mistress. She was a predator, climbing the ladder with deceit and seduction, leaving wreckage behind. Tiffany's face turned crimson. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle, desperate. "They're lying. They're jealous," she cried, her voice cracking. Yet no one believed her now. The evidence of her arrogance, her cruelty, and her schemes was unraveling faster than she could deny it. Richard's shoulders slumped as the truth settled on him like a crushing weight. The woman he had chosen over his family, the woman he defended moments earlier, was being stripped bare in front of everyone he once hoped to impress. For Tiffany, the ballroom had transformed from a stage into a courtroom, and her jury was unforgiving. Her empire of illusions was collapsing, brick by brick, under the testimony of those she thought too small to matter. The room crackled with tension. Testimonies against Tiffany piled higher than the crystal glasses on the tables, and yet I had remained silent. My cheek still stung from her slap, but my heart was steady now. I realized this was my moment. Not to scream, not to curse, but to reclaim what had been mine all along, my dignity. I lifted my napkin slowly, dabbed at the corner of my mouth, and then placed it neatly on the table. The crowd watched me, waiting for an outburst, waiting for the betrayed wife to shatter into pieces. Instead, I rose to my feet with quiet grace. My voice was calm, but it carried across the ballroom. "A woman's dignity," I said softly, "does not need noise. It does not need claws or cruelty. It needs only truth." Every whisper ceased. Tiffany froze, her red lips parted, but no sound coming out. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside her, as though the ground itself was slipping away. I looked directly at Tiffany. "You thought by striking me, you could erase me. You thought my silence meant weakness. But let me tell you something. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade." I turned my gaze to Richard. "And you, my husband, forgot that vows are not ornaments to display when convenient. They are bonds. You broke yours long before tonight. But the truth always arrives, whether you invite it or not." The audience held its breath. No shouting, no spectacle, just a steady voice that cut deeper than Tiffany's slap ever could. Then I smiled, a small, steady smile that carried more power than anger. "I don't need to fight to win. You've both already destroyed yourselves." Gasps echoed. Some guests clapped quietly, others nodded in silent respect. In that instant, I was no longer the humiliated wife. I was the woman who had endured, who had chosen grace over chaos. And that grace was the final blow Tiffany never saw coming. The ballroom was already heavy with silence when David stepped forward again, the folder still in his hand. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw the fire of a son who would not let his mother's dignity be trampled again. Then he turned to face Richard and Tiffany, his voice carrying the precision of a closing argument. "Tonight we've heard about betrayal," David began, "but betrayal doesn't just wound hearts, it empties bank accounts." He opened the folder, spreading documents across a nearby table for everyone to see. "Here are the records of funds siphoned from my parents' joint accounts. Tens of thousands of dollars moved without my mother's knowledge. Hotel bills in New Orleans, spa treatments in Miami, jewelry from New York, all in Tiffany's name." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Investors leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the pages. A board member muttered, "This is criminal." David pressed on. "This isn't about private shame anymore. This is corporate fraud. Money that should have strengthened Richard Collins' real estate was instead funneled into personal indulgence. And Tiffany here," he gestured toward her trembling figure, "was the direct beneficiary." Richard's face collapsed. "David, stop this," he stammered, but his voice shook with fear, not authority. "No," David cut him off. "You stop. You've lied to your family, to your company, and to yourself. Tonight, in front of Dallas' most respected leaders, the truth is exposed." The board members exchanged grim looks. One finally stood and said coldly, "Mr. Collins, this will be reviewed immediately. You may consider your position suspended until further notice." Tiffany's hand slipped from Richard's arm. Her painted confidence had drained into ash. I stood in silence, my sons flanking me like guardians, as Richard's empire crumbled before his very eyes. This wasn't my revenge, it was justice. And justice, once awakened, shows no mercy. The weeks that followed the gala were a storm Richard could not escape. The board suspended him, investors pulled back, and Tiffany vanished overnight, taking with her whatever money she could siphon before the walls closed in. Richard was left with empty accounts, shattered credibility, and the hollow echo of his own mistakes. One evening, I found him on his knees in our living room, tears streaking down his face. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I've lost everything. Tiffany used me. She never loved me. Please, forgive me. Don't leave me." I stood there watching the man I had once adored reduced to a shell of himself. My sons were in the next room, their voices steady as they reminded me I didn't need to accept humiliation to keep dignity. And yet, for their sake, for the family we had built, I did not divorce him. But love was gone. What remained was responsibility, a fragile truce built not on affection, but on necessity. Richard lived each day with regret carved into his face. He carried his shame like a shadow, sitting quietly at dinners, avoiding my gaze. He had lost the power to wound me because I had already risen above him. And I found joy elsewhere. I poured my energy into my friends at church, into community work, into laughter-filled afternoons with my grandchildren. Their little arms around my neck reminded me that love still existed, pure and untainted. I was no longer the woman Tiffany tried to erase. I was a mother, a grandmother, a survivor who had chosen grace over bitterness. As I watched my grandkids play in the Texas sun, I whispered to myself, "Silence is not weakness. Silence is strength. It waits, and when the time is right, it speaks louder than betrayal ever could." If you're still here with me now, thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe, because every story of survival deserves to be heard.